Hey everyone, in this video we'll show you how to install a high-performance Rockford Fosgate audio system on this Harley-Davidson motorcycle. Welcome back, I'm Eric, and today we're going to install an HD14CVO-STAGE2 on this Road Glide. The first thing we need to do is make sure that we have the bike flashed by an authorized Rockford Fosgate dealer. Now we have a list of these dealers that can flash on our website. The Harley-Davidson radio contains an excessive EQ curve that's preset by the factory. Now this is fine for an OEM setup, but with the high performance aftermarket system, we need to get rid of that EQ curve. This will allow you to experience the full potential of the audio system. To get started, we'll remove the thumb screws that keep the seat in place and use a 10mm socket to disconnect the battery negative. Okay, now we're ready to remove the fairing. First, we'll install the service cover on our fairing. We'll use a 3/16 Allen driver to remove a screw from each marker light. Then, use a T25 Torx driver to remove 4 bolts from the inner side of the fairing. Next, we'll use a 1/8 inch Allen to remove 4 screws holding the visor and upper fairing in place. Now, there are 2 additional screws that are located behind the speaker grills. We'll use a small nylon pry tool to pop out the speaker grills from behind. At this step, it's best to have 2 people. One to hold the fairing in position and the other to remove the screws. To do that, you'll use a T27 Torx to remove 1 from each side. We'll disconnect 2 small harnesses located on the top and remove the fairing. Okay, before we proceed, we need to remove the headlight. First, disconnect the harness and antenna that attach to the top of the headlight. Then, using a 3/16 Allen wrench, remove 4 screws that hold it in place. Pull out the headlight and disconnect the electrical harness and back. Now we're ready to remove the factory boom audio amplifier. To get started, take a photo or mark the cables while disconnecting them from the back of the radio. Use a 3/16 Allen wrench to remove 4 screws holding the radio in place. Then we'll use a 3/8 inch ratcheting crescent to remove 4 bolts from the side of the boom amp bracket. Disconnect the harness from the amplifier. Then, while holding it from both ends, push it down and slide it out from the cage and carefully remove it. Okay, now that we have that done, we're ready to remove the gas tank. We'll start off by disconnecting the electrical harness and pulling the breather line located in the back. Next, we'll disconnect the gas line. Push up on the hose and while sliding the fitting upward, pull down on the gas line. Once that's done, we'll detach 2 rubber boots from both sides of the front of the gas tank and use a 1/2 inch socket to remove those 2 bolts. Then we'll go to the back of the gas tank and remove the other 2 bolts using the same socket. Now we're ready to install our power harness. First, cut off any zip ties and unsnap the center channel cover. Next, we'll need to run our power harness on the left side of the forks through a plastic retaining bracket. Now for this next step, be sure to use a plastic removal tool. Do not use a flathead screwdriver or you'll likely chip the paint. Slide up underneath the retaining bracket and pop it off while pulling on the top. Pull it back slightly to route our power harness through without breaking the bracket. Finish routing the harness through the center channel and with enough slack for connection to the battery. Pull any additional slack toward the fairing. Now we're ready to prep our amp bracket. First, position the bracket on the heatsink with the Diamond R logo and the flaps facing the same way. Note the direction of the heatsink fins. Then, use a 2mm Allen wrench to secure 4 flush mount screws into the amp plate labeled 2015 Plus Road Glide. Once that's done, remove the power connector from the amplifier since our power harness already has one installed. Then, position the amplifier with the logo sitting between the flaps on the bracket and use a 2.5mm Allen and 4 provided screws to secure the amp to the heatsink. Now that we're done with that, we're ready to tune our amplifier and install it. You'll need the tune before proceeding. So we offer this free amp tuning guide that's available in the description of this video and through this kit's product details page at rockfordfosgate.com. And once that's done, take the amplifier assembly, flip it over, and slide it up under the radio bracket so the lip slides into the radio bracket itself. Then use a 5/16 wrench and socket to secure the flaps to the underside of the bracket using the supplied nuts and bolts. Now we're ready to install our T-harness. First, take the harness that we removed from the source unit and plug it into the female connector of our T-harness. Slide the lever closed until you hear it click into place. Then, we'll take the harness labeled amp input and plug both into the corresponding front and rear inputs of the amplifier. Take the harness labeled amp output and plug both into the corresponding front and rear outputs. Plug the power harness into the power connector on the amp and plug the blue wire into the empty connector on the top of the brake side. This blue wire is the amplifier remote turn on, so take note that there is likely an empty plug that needs to be removed. Now we're ready to reinstall our factory source unit. Since we have the radio out, I like to gently clean the faceplate and fairing bezel with a microfiber towel to remove any dust around the edges. Once we're done with that, we'll carefully position the unit back in place without pinching the input wires to the amplifier. We'll use a 3/16 Allen driver to secure the 4 screws that hold the radio in place. Then we'll plug in the remaining end of our T-harness into the radio and slide the lever until it locks into place. Finally, refer back to your photo or labels that we originally made and reattach the connections to the back of the radio. Now we're ready to clean up our wiring. You likely noticed some extra wires in our T-harness and included in the kit. Now this harness allows you to use our DSR1 digital signal processor. For more information, download our DSR1 setup guide for Harley-Davidson and keep an eye out for a complete configuration video we'll be releasing in the future. Now, since we're not using a DSR1 on this motorcycle, we'll zip tie this blue wire that's used with the processor. We'll also include 2 sets of Y adapters that are not used on this motorcycle but are covered in other videos. Now we're ready to remove the factory equipment and install our new speakers. The TMS 6.5 speakers included in your kit contain extra grills for Street Glide and Tour Pack installs. For our shark nose fairing, we're going to use this wave style grill. We'll start by using a T25 Torx and remove 4 screws that hold the factory speaker and disconnect the wiring harness. When removing the speakers, there's a tab on the top of the fairing that holds the grill in place. To avoid potentially scratching the paint, you may need to use a 3/16 Allen to remove 2 screws on the top and loosen 3 screws on the bottom that hold the speaker pod in place. There's also an extra harness used for the boom audio tweeters that will zip tie out of the way. Now, once that's done, we'll install our new speakers by connecting the white terminal to the positive and the black terminal to the negative. Then, use the existing hardware to secure the speaker into place, noting the alignment of the logo toward the bottom. Once you're done, repeat the process on the opposite side. Now that we're done with that, we're ready to replace our bag lid speakers. Using a T20 Torx driver, remove 4 screws from the inside of the bag lid speaker housing. Hold the grill in place while removing the last screw. Then, remove the 4 screws holding the factory 5x7 and detach both plugs. Now we're ready to install the new TMS57 speakers. First, orient the terminals in the same direction as the factory speakers and plug in the connector. The secondary harness for the boom audio tweeter will be left unused. Then, using the same hardware, install the new 5x7 and speaker grill. Now we've included a rebadge kit to cover the existing Harley-Davidson logos. Once you're done with that, repeat the process on the other side. Now we'll show you how to bypass the factory amplifier so we can use our TM400X4 AD. First, take the 2 plugs from your amp mounting kit labeled Boom Amp Bypass. Now newer versions of these plugs will be labeled CVO 4-speaker Boom 2. Plug 1 bypass into the harness we originally moved from the factory amp under the fairing. Then, inside our left bag lid, detach the wiring harness from the second factory amp and insert the other bypass plug into the harness. Now that we have that done, we'll reinstall our headlight and clean up our wiring. We'll tuck in our T-harness so that we'll clear the fairing and reattach the headlight. We'll also reattach the antenna back in place and zip tie all the harnesses out of the way. Once that's done, we'll go ahead and reattach the fairing. Alright guys, we're in the final stretch and we're ready to make our battery connections. We'll disconnect the couple harnesses, then use a 1/2-inch socket to remove 2 screws that hold the engine control module tray in place. We'll flip the ECM up and make our positive terminal connection using a 10mm socket. Then, we'll reconnect our negative cable along with our amp ground. Once that's done, we'll put everything back in place. Now that we have the bike reassembled, we're ready to test the system. Now, I want to reiterate before doing this, make sure that the factory radio is flashed. Now, we do get a lot of questions about the maintenance of the system, and since the speakers are element ready, they can actually get wet. Just rinse them off and avoid using a pressure washer. As you can see, that install was pretty straightforward. Now, if you prefer to have a professional do the install for you, we have a network of authorized Rockford Fosgate dealers that can be found on our website. So, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact our technical support. They can be reached Monday through Friday at 1-800-669-9899 or through live chat at the bottom of our website at rockfordfosgate.com. Until next time, I'm Eric. We'll see you again soon.